Has anybody ever been in trouble before? I mean, significant trouble, like the type of trouble where your parents and you are summoned to the vice principal's office type of trouble. You ever been in that kind of trouble? I see heads shaking. Maybe I'm the only one. Believe it or not, of all my brothers, I was the least well-behaved. But here's the thing. If you have any idea of what that situation is like, what it's like to be in trouble and have to go to an audience with someone who's going to try to force their authority over you, if you know what that feels like, then maybe you can understand the gospel passage today. Because over and over again in the Gospels, we often hear stories of Jesus going to celebrate with various people meals at this person's home or at this person's home, wedding banquets where he makes sure the booze doesn't run out. Remember Cana, he multiplied the wine? Great guy. Well, here's the thing. This is one of the first times we hear in the Gospels where Jesus isn't going to dinner because they're really excited to have him. He is dining at the home of the head Pharisee. We hear about Pharisees all throughout the Gospels, but here's what the Pharisees were about. The Pharisees were the religious and the political leaders kind of in the small towns and around Jerusalem. They were the authorities who got to determine the religious rules and the ways in which you had to live your life. They had the power to tell you how to live, what to do, and what not to do. But they also had the power to tell you that you were a sinner, or that you were unclean, or that you were unworthy. Because the thing is, they thought that they were chosen and selected by God. They thought they were better than everyone, and they thought that then they had to control who had access to God. And so if your life wasn't perfect, they would publicly call you out as a sinner. If your life, if you weren't perfectly healthy, maybe they would say, oh, you're sick because it's a curse from God. And they would say, you can't go to the synagogue to worship. Or, even worse, they might forbid you from going to the temple in Jerusalem to worship on the high holy days. This is how the Pharisees would often look after people. They were often called out by Jesus as self-righteous and hypocrites. And so when Jesus is being invited by them to their home for dinner, he's in trouble. They're inviting him to their home because they want to find a way that they can accuse him of something. They want him to make a mistake so that they can publicly denounce him because Jesus said and did everything in direct opposition to the Pharisees. Jesus threatened their authority. Jesus threatened their religious power. He taught as one who had authority, which was a direct opposition to the Pharisees who thought they were in charge. Jesus, not only did he disagree with them publicly, but the Pharisees who, when they saw someone and said, oh, you're a sinner, you don't belong, you're not good enough, or if you're sick or lame or crippled or blind, you're not welcome, you're not included. You remember what Jesus did over and over again? He welcomed the sinners. He healed and cared for the sick and the lame and the blind. So everything he did was in direct opposition to the Pharisees, and here he goes to the Pharisees' home for dinner. He's in trouble. But rather than trying to be meek and quiet and avoiding a fight, you know, sometimes when you're in a tense situation, the best approach is to just keep your mouth closed. You know, that's good advice, right? Yes. Yes. I've never been able to follow that advice. Neither did Jesus. Because the first thing he says to the Pharisees, he calls out their arrogance. He calls out their pride. He's sitting there watching everybody as they sit down at table. And back then, where you sat at the table was a whole lot more significant than it is today. Because the closer you were to the host, the one who was throwing the party, the more important you were. And this was the head guy. This was the leading Pharisee of the town. And so here's all these Pharisees trying to sit closer to the host. And Jesus immediately calls out their arrogance. You silly people, he says, here you're jockeying for position. All you care about is your own ego and your own pride, and you're constantly trying to get the better seat. Rather than sitting there quietly and just kind of accepting the situation, Jesus immediately confronts and points out their hypocrisy, their arrogance, and their self-righteousness. And he says, humble yourself or you will be humbled by God. But he doesn't leave it at that. He then turns to the guy in charge, the most important person in the town, the head Pharisees, and he says, you, the guy in charge, next time you throw a banquet, I want you to invite the blind, the lame, the crippled, and the unwanted. Why? Not because Jesus is suggesting a new guest list. But notice, these are the same people that Pharisee has been telling over and over, they weren't clean, they weren't worthy, they weren't holy enough to worship in the synagogue or go to the temple to offer sacrifice. Jesus says to the head Pharisee, you, next time you throw this dinner, this banquet, I want you to invite all the people that you've been excluding from the kingdom of God. Because you've got this whole thing backwards. You think your job is to keep the unholy people out, when in fact I'm here to welcome everybody in. And so, the next time you throw a banquet, all the people who you thought weren't good enough, you invite them first. These are the people that the kingdom of God is for. The people that everyone thinks are not worthy or good enough or holy enough or pure enough. This is who belong more than the wealthy, the powerful, the important. That's why Jesus tells this parable. That's why his command and his confrontation of their self-righteousness, their arrogance, and their love of power is so startling. And so as we listen to this gospel passage, I want to offer two thoughts. One, I hope that this comforts us in some way. Because I don't know about you, my life isn't perfect. And so the idea that Jesus is very willing and very open to welcome me, to welcome us, no matter how broken or bruised, no matter how messy or morally out of joint our lives may be, we are still always welcome. No matter how unworthy we feel at times, we are very much wanted. Secondarily, I hope this challenges us. Because in some sense, we have a lot of religious leaders in our world. There are a lot of strong voices who are saying the same things today that those Pharisees said so long ago. We have too many religious voices in our world who are way too comfortable in pointing out how people are sinners and how they shouldn't belong or shouldn't fit in or aren't worthy or pure enough or holy enough. We've got too many people in our world pointing out other people's faults and using them as leverage to keep them out. To tell them they're not wanted or they're not good enough. All too often in our world, especially in our Christian world, these voices seem to dominate, whether it's in the media or whether it's in normal life. We must confront these voices and say, no, this is not the gospel of Jesus. This is not what Jesus was about. In fact, we need to invite in all those who those voices rally against. The priority of our faith ought to be aimed at those whose lives are messy, sinners, the unclean, the broken, those who feel as if they're unwanted or don't fit in. But the challenge is, and I don't know if you realize this, there's a lot of people not that far from here who feel as if they're not wanted by us, who feel as if some way, some shape or form, someone told them that because their life is a mess, we don't want them. I'll never meet them. Because I'm not the places where you are. I don't sit in the classes in which you sit. I don't attend the day drinks that you go to. I'm not at the parties that you go to. I'm not in the places where you are. The only way that the people who need to hear this message will hear it is from you. I can't share this with everyone. I can tell you and inspire you and try to give you the real strength and the challenge of the gospel of Jesus Christ. But the only way that this message gets out there is if you take it. And I want to ask you to please think about that, especially at the beginning of this year. Can we share this message? It's going to be hard, I'll be honest with you. Because first off, you've got to admit that you're kind of a Christian first. And then, of course, maybe even a Catholic, which is difficult, especially in today's day and age. But what would that be like if we actually invited people? If we took the challenge of Jesus Christ to heart and we invited people, those who thought they didn't fit in, those who thought they weren't wanted, those who feel as if our faith so often marginalizes, minimizes, condescends, and condemns them. What would it look like if we invited them? Rather, what would it look like if you invited them?